few very brief introductory remarks, and then I think we will immediately move to our panelists, and maybe about 5 to 7 minutes each, we should try to pitch the whole debate, and then we can have, some counter views. I think this is a topic which definitely is going to invite a lot of questions. I've been in similar topics, similar gatherings elsewhere, and there are always a large number of questions. So I would be very keen that we try to keep at least 30 to 40 minutes, if possible, at the end of this session. So first of all, we are all quite aware that in India, this rewriting history, pitfalls and opportunities has been a perennial debate. We forget that it's not the case of India alone. There are very hot controversies on writing and rewriting of history in a number of countries, from the US to European countries to Israel and of course China and so on and so forth. Since you all know the pithy dictum of George Orwell, who said, "He who controls the past controls the future." So he who controls the past certainly controls the identity that a nation, a society tries to have. So therefore, a lot is at stake in history, even though at school our students regard it as the least important and the most boring topic of all, but that is for other reasons. A lot is at stake, and we all know that there have been several schools of historiography, that is to say, the approach to the writing of history in India. The debates have not always been very civilized as they should be. There's been a lot of mudslinging on the way. There have been issues crystallizing this whole debate, for example, the Ayodhya issue, but many others. The Aryan issue as far as ancient India is concerned. Also a lot of issues to do with the freedom movement and so on and so forth. So we are a nation rich in history, and therefore we are a nation rich in historical controversies. And in a way it's healthy. The problem is, how should these controversies be handled? What are the rules? What should be the rules of the game? And what are actually on the ground the rules of the game in India today? So pitfalls, what is to be avoided, what wrong examples do we have about the rewriting of history? And of course, there will be the issue at some point of the question of textbooks. History textbooks also have been one of the burning topics in this broader topic of history, a controversy in the rewriting of history. And in India, there is no clear policy, even a government policy, as to when should a history textbook be revised, rewritten, under what circumstances and by whom, who is qualified to do that, are all historians qualified to write good textbooks, and so on and so forth. So, as always, a lot of confusion and a lot of media involvement, which has sometimes polarized things and sometimes also masked the real issues for the sake of more sensational, debates on this personality or that school, etc. So I think we'll follow the natural order, starting with Mr. Prasenjit Basu, who is based in Singapore and who is the author of the book he has in front of him, Asia Reborn. As you can see, it's not a thin book, so the weight of it speaks for itself. Some of you might have seen him on a video which I think circulated quite a lot. I will not say, it was a short video clip a few months ago. I'll not say more about it. Some of you will remember. And therefore, I would like to have your take on these issues. And maybe 5 to 7 minutes to begin with, and we'll have a further round later.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think, of course, in India, since at least the 1970s, the writing of history has been dominated by the Marxist school. I have a number of college mates of mine who are now academics, and they're all Marxists. They may be sitting in Germany or France or the United States, but if they're writing about Indian history, they're Marxists. So it's quite simple. If you want to write about Indian history, you have to be a Marxist, and you have to think in that way: class struggle, forces of production, means of production. I know the lingo because in college, I was of the left as well, like most Bengalis of that age. So, but I say I saw the light twice because, Marxism is like a religion. It very much is a religion. You have to believe in the whole system of thought to be a Marxist. And so you see the light to become a Marxist, full light dawns on you. Then in order to cease to be a Marxist, you have to see the full light again. And luckily, I saw the light twice. Anyway, now, another way of thinking about the way history is taught in schools in India, I think is like the New Testament. If you read the Christian New Testament, the villains are the Pharisees. The Pharisees are so basically the New Testament is an anti-Jewish text. But instead of saying we are anti-Judaism, they call them Pharisees. And basically the Pharisees are there to be attacked. Similarly, in the writing of Indian history, Brahminical Hinduism is to be attacked. And the whole story of Indian history is of all the people who tried and failed to reform Brahminical Hinduism. This is the story. This is the overall story that we were taught in school. And, it is tragic because yesterday I was in Bangkok. The king of Thailand is called Rama. Rama the 10th. He is now the 10th of the line of this Chakri dynasty. He is Ram. The previous capital of Thailand is Ayodhya. Ayutthaya, they pronounce it Ayutthaya. And in Indonesia, in Java and Sumatra, most of the people are nominally Muslims, but they all have names like Mahendra. They have names like, the founding president of Indonesia was Sukarno. Actually, that is good Karn. See, Karn is an ambivalent figure in the Mahabharata. He is half brother of the Pandavas. He supported Duryodhan right through. He was with the wrong side in the battle of good versus evil. But you see, if you think about the whole history of the Sanatan Dharma does not believe in black and white. They are all shades of grey. Anyway, in these shades of grey, Karn is more dark than light grey. So you can't be called Karn. You have to be called Sukarn. He's the good version of Karn. So Sukarno is the founder of this country, of Indonesia. In Indonesia, the greatest hero of Indonesian history, there are two. One is called Airlangga, and the other is called Kartanegara. Karta, now Negara is the Malay word or Bahasa word for nation. Nagar becomes nation, so slight variation. He's the Karta of the Nagar. So the national Karta was the greatest hero. And when his father Airlangga got married, he was actually Balinese. He married a princess of Mataram, which was a Sanatani kingdom that ruled most of Java. And the greatest epic of the Javanese is called Arjuna Vivaha. So Indonesia has no problem with the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. My daughter went to Yale NUS College. She was in the first batch of this new college called Yale NUS College. Every student of Yale NUS College compulsorily studies the Ramayana in their first semester. Has any of us studied the Ramayana? In school and college? Yeah, if you lived in Pondicherry, you probably have, and in a few other places. But in most of, so the tragedy of modern India, I think, is that I am speaking to you in English. This is a tragedy. Michel comes and speaks to us in English. We should be speaking in Sanskrit, perhaps. If not Hindi, then why not Sanskrit? Sanskrit is the linked language that is part of every Indian language. And yet, Sanskrit was almost banned. But we have a next session on that coming up. So let's set that aside for now. Next session, I think they'll do a better job because they have some real Sanskrit scholars. Here we are stuck with English. Now, I think, one of the things that my book tries to do is to look at why it is that the parts of Asia that were ruled by Japan are all the most prosperous parts of Asia today. And the parts of Asia that were ruled by Britain or other European powers are the poorest. And the answer is actually very simple. It is this, that basically the British came here to loot. And in the first 110 years or so, they were basically looting. Then they settled down to rule. And when they were settling down to rule, they said, we must divide these people into as many subgroups as possible. And those subgroups inform our history. They inform the way our national discourse occurs. So it's either Hindu versus Muslim, or it's lower caste versus upper caste, or it's scheduled caste versus backward caste versus scheduled tribe versus Brahmin versus Kshatriya versus God knows what. And these divisions were a consequence of British rule. Now, if you look at Korea, can you think of Korean society as being divided in any way? The only division that they could find was after the Japanese had left. When the Japanese were ruling, there were no divisions. They wanted to develop Korea. Of course, initially they imposed Japanese, but eventually they allowed Korean. Within 10 years, they allowed Korean to be taught in the schools also. And they, in order to develop Korea, they needed to educate the people, and they did. So in India, and if you think about even the French colonies and the Dutch colonies, there was hardly any education of the locals. And so literacy was really low in all the European colonies in Asia. The American colony was a bit different. Philippines had higher literacy. But the Japanese educated people not only in normal literacy, but they also introduced engineering and so on. Because you need engineers. If you're going to have steel industries, if you're going to have heavy machinery, if you're going to do shipbuilding. None of that happened with us. And the tragedy for us is that we inherited the British way of thinking about us, added a Marxist overlay on it, and that has become the basis of the way we interact, the way we think, and the way policy discourse occurs in our country. And it is a debilitating thing. To my mind, it is debilitating because it is a system of thought that is somewhat alien. We, of course, are speaking in English. English itself is the greatest barrier to entry into the classes that rule in India. Narendra Modi ji is perhaps a rare example of a non-English speaker who's also being forced to learn English, by the way. You notice how he increasingly makes speeches in English? But in Korea and Japan, there's no such need. There is no concept of an expatriate. You know, in Singapore, when I first went to Singapore, I had my brain certified in America. So I was an expatriate. It's a remarkable thing. I found that I was offered a salary 3 times what I was making in America to come to Singapore. I said, this is fantastic. Of course, I should come. Then I found that I was also making 2 times what my Singaporean colleagues were making. They had the same qualifications. They were doing the same thing. I was given a house. I was given all kinds of other things. I was an expatriate. Now, most expatriates are non-Asians. In Asia, expatriates are generally Europeans or Americans. So I was one of the rare Asians. I only was an expatriate for about 3 years, then I became a permanent resident and I ceased to be an expatriate. But this concept exists only in the former European colonies. And this mindset is very much part of the way history is written, the way the normal discourse in the press and so on occurs. And does not occur in this way at all in Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, or even in China. There is no such thing as an expatriate. And fortunately, in India also, that aspect is missing because we have the English-speaking creamy layer that is already the local expatriates of India. So, yeah, I think we have to get rid of this mindset, the colonial mindset that has seeped deep into our mentality. And perhaps that is the one thing that I will introduce as my perspective on this theme. There are many others, of course. There's lots and lots of history that I've rewritten in this book. Almost every page, as Professor Virupaksha will, anybody who has read the book will know, almost every second page, there's something that will shock you, something that you think you knew, but actually is wrong. But for now, it's just this thing that I'll leave you with.
So thank you, Prasenjit. I think this, in a way, lays the foundation of the debate. Now we move on to Rajat Sethi, who is the author of a book, The Last Battle of Saragat, which is, I think, the story of the rise of the BJP in the Northeast. And we want to hear your views on this whole debate about history and the controversy of history writing.
Thank you so much. And fundamental things have been laid out by Prasenjit ji. I will just try to add on a very layman's perspective, and there are very knowledgeable historians out here. I have been an engineer. My academic training was on the foundation of science. So I expected every other professor of every other stream to be causality driven, like there has to be a cause for every inference that you draw. There has to be a rational approach to any inference in general, in any stream of education that you want to study. As an engineer, you tend to expect this as a bare minimum from any professor. But then I was in a state of shock when I moved from that very, very rational world, and I ended up in exploring myself on my very own, these uncharted territories of history and where the conflicts come in, and how professors and their proteges tend to defend territories and domains. And it's almost like you, as a rationalist, are standing in crossfire happening, and either one set of ideology or doctrines on one side, the other doctrine equally aggressive on the other side, shooting at each other, and you are just caught unaware, still expecting, still hoping that there is some truth somewhere. And then there are these people who come out and say, then there is no truth. It's all interpretations after interpretations, and history is written by people in power. And there is nobody who can save history from politicians. So history is hijacked by politics of the day, and it will always happen as long as the human race is there. So there is no search for truth. It's all about finding interpretations, finding interesting interpretations, which can add on to the understanding and break the unilateral view or a unilateral understanding of what has been pushed down generations after generations very carefully. When I moved to Harvard and I started studying political science in a more disciplined manner, I was subjected to each of these various interpretations of colonial history of our own country, stretching all the way up to understanding the civil rights movement in the US and its constant reinterpretation. What I was told by one of the professors there was that interpretation of history is a doctrinal exercise, and doctrines matter as much as flavors of an ice cream matter. Some people like strawberry and the others like vanilla. Now, it's not about which flavor is better. These are two different flavors, and you just can't, there is no metric which has been evolved to compare these two things. So now this is a very, very simplistic view of covering over a lot of politics which happen, the dirty wars that happen in political books. This was a very sweetener added over to this, this war which happens in history books. So that was the first cue that I got from my professor. And then I gradually started exploring history of my own and understanding that what could be alternate views, perspectives, and visions, etc., which has been kept away from us because of the deliberate politics behind it. I can tell you several examples of, and I interacted with a lot of my friends who had a chance to study at JNU. I mean, a very simple example that can come to my mind right now is that in JNU, we all know that it's a Marxist-dominated school of thought. The economics department doesn't even teach you the economic theories, which are pretty much backed by evidences and by facts. They just don't teach you because it's going to break the, the carefully built fortress of the Marxist thoughts. And how do they do that? By not allowing any international economic theory to come down and seep into and malign the content that they are teaching. Economic theory as a subject is a very vital, fundamental subject to understand economics, because if you do not study, you're just missing out on any other worldview of economics that exists. The entire cabal sitting in JNU pushed economic theory out of the economics department, and it ended up in international relations department. What was economic theory, international economic theory doing in international relations department? You need to understand. Such is the powerful, academic feudal lords that sit over carefully nurtured curriculums. And anybody challenging that curriculum is effectively challenging the fortress which has been carefully preserved over generations. And how is this academic feudalism, handed out, protected over generations and pushed? To understand that, you need to understand how academic research happens. And it is pretty much true everywhere. I have seen it myself in the US. I know for a fact that things are very wrong in UK also. And it's even more dirtier in India, but it is there. Professors and their research scholars act as a family. These proteges are trained to follow the diktats of their master. And if they don't, the consequences are very easily laid out. You will not be able to carry forward your research. You will not get those limited scholarships to have a foreign visit. You will not be able to publish papers in journals which are protected by these gatekeepers who belong to the same fraternity, who've been very carefully have been the proteges of the earlier generation, who are now the gatekeepers. Basically, you are completely kept out of that system of academic validation. One of my friends who studied economics did his PhD from New York University and finished it just 1 year back. He his specialization lay in international economics again, and more to do with understanding the fall of Venezuela and the reasons behind it. And he wanted to come back to India and wanted to teach in India. You can imagine if his thesis topic is Venezuela and its failure, where will he land up in India? He did not get any academic shortlist for an interview. He then moved to Europe and eventually became a professor. But so much is the scare of this ecosystem that he writes articles in Indian newspaper under pseudonyms. He is still not a tenured professor. in Europe, but he fears that this parasitic system has its tentacles so strong and deep that it will affect his future. He will not be able to express freely what he genuinely thinks, and it is backed by certain facts that he has researched. It is not judgmental calls that he is sitting and making. So this is how the system has been completely choked of any fresh light coming into and trying to challenge the status quo. You will be surprised, the prodigies, these research scholars, are trained and nurtured in such careful manner that they basically, it's a black box of truth, which they have to pick from one generation of professors and carry it along with during their lifetime and hand it over to the next set of prodigies, such that it is not contaminated by other truth. That is their goal. How do you do that carefully is the part of their training. No, in India, absolutely. An academic world in general has had a bent, a liberal bent, which is all fine with me. And I have been a liberal student myself, liberal arts student myself. I have done my engineering, but I have graduated from there and have studied in a disciplined manner these subjects as well. And I'm telling you with experience. Now, my workplace, my karma bhumi has been Northeast. You can all understand that Northeast pretty much has been painted by red paint, that this is the land of Gori, as in there are mud, there is bloodbath happening, insurgency happening. It's not a safe place for Indians to go there, to travel there, and make it part of the growth story of the country. One should really understand why was this entire region, entire set of peoples who were kept deliberately debarred from any nationalism exercise right from the days of Nehru. This nation building project was left incomplete in the northeastern region, and I would dare say it was done deliberately. It was deliberately, these scholars sitting in Delhi formed a very closed clique with the people from the Northeast only, who were teaching in places, in universities in the Northeast. Lot of the insurgent groups, you pick any group, there are more than, I would say, 85 active insurgent groups in various states in the Northeastern region, who have been led by people who have done their PhDs, who've done their masters from Oxford, from Cambridge. These are the people who have waged war against India. And I was very curious, because from Boston I landed up in Guwahati and started working immediately. And with that method of inquiries I was trained in those method of inquiries, and I wanted to understand what has motivated these young people, really smart gentlemen who could have really pushed the future of Northeast in a very bright way. Why have they taken up arms against the country? The one very important source of understanding that is to look into the literature, the propaganda material that is being published. Who are writing those propaganda material? What are they writing? Where are they getting the intellectual backing to make those statements? That is where the real war begins. The real war on history begins. They have been informed that Northeast, culturally, racially, has never been part of India, has never been part of Bharatvarsha. Their history of Assam that they teach starts with Sukafa's invasion, when Sukafa, who was the Thai is the Thailand of the past, when he was as a Thai ruler, he came to Kamrup, settled there and civilized that place. That is where their history begins with. So it's a different race of people. It's the Indo-Tibetan race of people who've come to India and have established their kingdom, and so far it has no relationship with India. That this dating in itself is the most critical thing. They don't tell you that there was an empire which was called Pragjyotishpur, which was the predecessor to Assam, which has such beautiful historic links to Bharatvarsh. Let us not go that much in the past. We are never even taught that there was this Burman empire, far more powerful, that existed the entire region of Myanmar, Tripura, their headquarters were in Tripura, and they controlled the entire land of the northeastern region. And they were pretty much part of this Akhand Bharat conceptualization that we all have. So there have been rulers in the past before Sukafa came in, but we are never taught this, and therefore the insurgents, they get this intellectual idea that Northeast has never been a part of this country. They can very well exist as an economically and a politically viable entity as a separate nation. What have our historians in our countries sitting with all the privileges in Delhi ever done about this cause? Have they tried to correct the course of history, which is, mind you, backed by facts and no interpretation? I'm not talking about any interpretation which might land up in different conclusions. These are bare facts. This is where my problem with the Western education, Indian education, little differs. Professors who've been educated outside and they've come here, they tend to even forget the facts. History is, of course, about facts and value judgments that you make. I think I'm right, Professor. But over here, they tend to even forget the facts. Value judgments are again open for deliberation, and then they carry on with their whatever they wish to publish. And very carefully, they have controlled all academic general publications that can happen. It's an enormous fight that I had to fight with Penguin Publication to publish my book. So that's a battle that I can discuss in detail, but these are the frontiers which have been controlled by one set of ideology and has never allowed space for us to come in.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you for setting the tone of the whole controversy. And now we move on to Meenakshi Jain, who is well known to most of you. She has written very important books on the Ayodhya controversy, on the Hindu-Muslim relations, on the issue of Sethi, and a few more. So let us have her
Good
views.
afternoon. I hope you can hear me all. Is the mic on?
Closer to your mouth.
Close. Okay. Is it all right now?
Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon. I think it will come as a surprise to most of us that the issue of textbook writing actually began in India just a few years after 1800. In 1800, Fort William College was established in Calcutta, and they employed a large number of Indians to help the British professors in translating the texts and for whatever purposes. The Indians who were employed in Fort William College, they were quick to grasp that they should control the narrative about their own past. So within a few years of 1800, 3 textbooks were written in Bengal by employees of the East India Company. And these 3 textbooks are very important because they consciously tried to depict the past in terms of the native traditions and native civilization. Though they were employees of the East India Company, they produced the first 3 textbooks. So these textbooks were not written by historians or scholars. They were written by ordinary people who were concerned that the narrative should not fall out of their hands. And soon after that, the first textbook was written in Hindi by Raja Shiv Prasad. And the title of that textbook was Itihas Timir Nasak. What is it? History as the Dispeller of Darkness. So there was a very conscious attempt by enlightened people to write our own history in our terms in the colonial period itself. That tradition continued during the entire British period, and it continued after India gained independence. In the British period, we had a lot of stalwarts like R.K. Mukherjee, Jagannath Sarkar, R.C. Majumdar, trying to set the narrative in Indic terms. Now the tragedy, when did this turn of events take place? In 1969, the Congress became a minority government, and it needed the support of some political party to remain in office. So it got the support of the left parties, and the left parties, they are very, very committed to their ideology, and they miss no opportunity to further that ideology. In return for supporting a Congress minority government, they asked for only one ministry. And that ministry that they asked for was the education ministry. And the person they appointed as education minister was Professor Nurul Hasan. Now, I don't know whether the Congress government was aware of that pitfall, or whether it was consciously ready to surrender that ground. Because before this, the Congress made many efforts to record its view or the Indian view of the freedom struggle. So it appointed the Indian Historical Records Commission that would record the role of Indians in winning their freedom. So the Congress party was also very conscious of the need to write the past. It appointed Jagannath Sarkar to edit a 30-volume work on the freedom struggle. Only the first volume came out. It appointed R.C. Majumdar. Indian History Congress was set up in 1930s. So all this narrative was going in one way until 1969, when the Congress needed left support to survive in government, and it handed over the education ministry to the left. After that, the whole subject of history became a one-sided narration of the past. Now the left was very aware that what are the steps they have to take to further their agenda. So they established institutions like the Indian Council of Historical Research. These bodies were set up when Nurul Hasan was the education minister. And in these bodies, the chairman was always a leading left historian. I'll come to these institutions later on, but since we are discussing history textbooks, what is important for us to recognize is that these historians realize that it is important to capture the mind when it is young. So these scholars of eminence, they decided that first they will write school textbooks. So I don't know of any other country in the world where professors will write history textbooks from 6th standard onward. So people like Romila Thapar, they wrote the history textbook for 6th standard, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra. So these leading lights of the left historians, they controlled and captured the textbooks. So that means from the time that the child is 12 years old, that is when the child will be in the 6th standard, till the 12th standard, every history that the child will read will be written by a left scholar. And after that, when you go to the university, then obviously you have to fall further prey to their history writing, because they will write the syllabus, they will dictate the readings. So the readings will also be systematically controlled. And in this context, I just want to make one side comment. Jagannath Sarkar wrote a 4-volume history of the downfall of the Mughal Empire and a 3-volume history of the history of Aurangzeb. And Jagannath Sarkar was very proficient in Persian, and he translated many Persian histories also into English. So Jagannath Sarkar, his works were based on Persian sources. If I write a history book today, I may not be able to cite every Persian source, but he cited every Persian source available. He was such a doin. 30 years later, Irfan Habib wrote the economic history of the Mughal Empire. And in that economic history of the Mughal Empire, he did not cite the name or the work of Jagannath Sarkar even once. So that is the way that the left has operated. And people say that what did the right do? I'm not trying to exonerate the right. I'm very conscious that they have failed in their duty, but I just want to say that the institutions of school education were not in the hands of the right for a very, very long time. So, an alternative view was not available to students. Now, this left historians who wrote about history, it is surprising that they continued the way Indian history was written by James Mills, etc. So they continued, while they are pretending to be leftists and they're pretending to have an objective view, actually they're continuing the British approach to Indian history, that is, that India is a nation of fragments and it is a story of caste animosity and it is a story of Brahmin exploitation of the of the people. So, one more thing, since Nurul Hasan was the education minister, it was a very clear, unstated agenda of school textbooks written by left and the recommended readings and books that they wrote for the college level, that it will be whitewashing or pushing under the carpet India's experience of the incursions of foreign groups into the country. I don't want to sound anti anybody, but what I do want to point out that India had foreign invasions even in the ancient period. We had Indo-Greeks, Kushans, Shakas. Now these people who came, they ruled over parts of India, they became rulers over parts of India. But each one of them attuned and imbibed the traditions of this country, the sacred traditions. The first, Kanishka became a promoter of Buddhism. The first inscription in Sanskrit was by Rudradaman Shaka. So they may have come as invaders, but they did immerse themselves in the spiritual, cultural ethos of this country. The invasions that take place in the medieval period, they give a totally new dimension to Indian history. And the left, it became a crime if you even mentioned these things. I was a student in university, many of these professors taught me, and it was, suddenly I realized that I'm being branded as a communal person if I'm just asking the right questions. And the way you mentioned that they ostracized you, I was a real victim of that ostracization. But even though we condemn the right historians, I think that I stood my ground and did not surrender. So you could not, now, like Romila Thapar's book on Somnath Temple, it is an history. And the other point that I want to make, that all these histories that the left historians wrote, they were based on histories written in Persian in the medieval period. They do not cite any non-Persian source for reconstructing the past. Whereas, as a student of history, I realize that there is a wealth of information in the regional languages which we need to take into account when we are writing a history of this period. We talk about, can I just take 2 minutes more? We talk a lot about Akbar's overtures to the Rajputs. That's certainly a very welcome development. But the point is, have we ever asked, what did the Rajputs view, how did the Rajputs view that relationship? So I'll give you the case of Raja Man Singh, who was related to Akbar and was his closest friend. And the Ain-e-Akbari says that, Akbar gave important posts to Rajputs. And then this Raja Man Singh, when he goes back to his court in Jaipur, he is very conscious that, how will my descendants view me? And he wants to explain to his descendants what are the compulsions that led me to this. So he got a biography authorized, he commissioned a biography, Ramcharit. That tells a different story of that same Mughal Rajput alliance, very different from what we see in the Aina Akbari written by Abul Fazl. So what I'm saying is that it is a one-sided interpretation of our past based on one-sided information. Last point that I want to make is that there was a very noted Sanskrit scholar in the Mughal period. His name was Jagannath Pandith. He was a very, very renowned Sanskrit scholar. And Jagannath Pandith, he is mentioned in Persian sources and in Persian histories of that period as a singer. They say Jagannath Pandith was a singer who came to the Mughal court, sang and got money from the emperor. So it is like, that he's comes as a singer, takes money and disappears. Until you read the non-Persian sources, you do not realize what a great Sanskrit scholar Jagannath Pandith was and what were the works that he wrote. And these non-Persian sources do not mention him singing at the medieval court at all. So when we write history, we have to realize that it's a very complex thing, and we should not limit ourselves to one particular type of sources. We should try to expand our reach and try to make it as inclusive as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi. Thank you to all our speakers. I would like to make a few brief remarks, and then I think we'll have to open the floor for the interaction with all of you. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Two points which were common to Prasenjit and Meenakshi was about the fact that the left, well, we call it Marxist School of historiography, but they're not always all Marxist today, but it doesn't matter, it's a detail. They were Marxist inspired. Anyway, let us call it the Leftist School as a term of convenience. I, at some point, did also call them neo-colonials because they have, in fact, as you both pointed out quite rightly, they have taken over all the stereotypes which British colonizers imposed on Indian society, early Indian society, religion, belief systems, philosophical systems, and so on and so forth. And they have actually, which is a great irony, because communism in the West was always anti-colonial. It is only in India that communism and all its derivatives turned out to not only be of very little assistance during the freedom movement, that is a detail almost, but in addition, they have actually reintegrated all the biases of the imperial rulers into which is, so it proves that India is the land of paradoxes. This is one remark. About Rajat Sethi's brilliant exposition of what happened, the distortions in the Northeast, it is something which several scholars have also written about. In fact, Ajamitra Shastri, the great epigraphist, once wrote a very brilliant little book on Prag-Jyotisha, where he summed up all the epigraphic evidence and all the deliberate misconceptions about separating, exactly what you said, separating Northeast from its linkage, its connection with the rest of India. So yes, but you see, the pity is that these kind of works are not highlighted, and this is where we face a major problem, that the debate is not even. There is no level playing field. If Romina Thapa has all the publishers at her feet, somebody like Ajamitra Shastri, who is no more anyway, will have to find some obscure little publisher somewhere, and the work will not be known. So this is one of the issues in the problem of rewriting history, that we do not have a level playing field. I also wanted, in connection, Rajat, if you permit, to remind about this interpretation of history. You see, there is one thing that we were told by this leftist school, and Irfan Habib and so on, which is that this was scientific history. They appropriated the term scientific precisely, as you also pointed out, that to make it appear that they were writing an objective, scientific, rigorous history, and of course blanking out a lot of whatever evidence, whatever sources did not match their predetermined conclusion. There's a great British anthropologist, possibly the tallest British anthropologist in the 20th century, Edmund Leach, who in 1989, at his deathbed almost, he passed away the next year, wrote a very brilliant paper called The Aryan Invasions of India, plural, where he completely demolished all those who promote the idea of Aryan invasion, and he explained why. But he begins by saying, and this is an anthropologist speaking, he begins by saying, all history is myth. That's a very powerful statement. Now, myth not in the day-to-day meaning, myth in the sense, anthropological sense, of a cultural construct. It's a construct. You want to construct a legend, a set of, a saga of something. So this is the anthropological myth which moves the whole society. So all history is myth. There is no such thing as objective history. And, but there could be more honest forms of history than others. So coming to Nurul Hasan, in fact, I can assure you that the Congress knew what it was doing. It was not out of ignorance because, as you said, Indira Gandhi needed the support of the left, and the left told her, we will give you support, but you give us the Ministry of Education. You might think that they would have asked for the Ministry of Finance or something. No, education. They know very well what they are doing. And these are precisely, you know, for the Congress ministers, education ministry was regarded as a punishment ministry. For most of the ministers, it was what they could, because they couldn't get finance, they couldn't get defense, they couldn't get foreign affairs. So this is where precisely there has been a major failing. Finally, one word about Asim Majumdar, because in a way, his history of the freedom movement in India is the very first case of rewriting of history that comes after independence. What happened is that the newly independent Indian government appointed a commission, as you mentioned, to write from an Indian point of view, and that is the irony, you will see in a minute, the history of the freedom movement in India, because we, of course, didn't want to have British versions of that. So far, so good, and all the state archives were mobilized, and the whole commission was, and then Asim Majumdar presented a blueprint of the whole project, which was to have many collaborators, many volumes, but then gradually his collaborators and the Congress party and Maulana Azad, who was at that time the education minister, realized that Asim Majumdar was going to take a critical view of the role of the Congress and Mahatma Gandhi in the freedom movement, in the sense that he was going to bring in actors, whatever tensions there might have been between all of them, you know, he was going to make it not a very simple story, and they didn't like that. So they pulled the carpet from under his feet and overnight appointed another historian, Tara Chand, to write the official history of the freedom movement in India, which is what was published eventually.
Very, very partisan view.
Very partisan, pro-Congress, in the sense that Congress alone and Gandhi alone were the architects of the freedom movement. So you see that these controversies are not new. As far as whitewashing the Islamic period, let us recall that there is a circular in the 1970s or 80s perhaps, there is a circular from the West Bengal government to all the schools and universities that the Islamic period should be projected in a positive light. Now, this is interesting because it means a government directly interfering into the writing of history and how history has to be written. So we know all of this, and we have all these material. The question is, where are the alternatives, and how do we build up an alternative school? And the answer so far is not very optimistic or positive. But with this, I would like now, we have full half hour, to open the floor for interaction. We'll take questions one by one. Once again, questions should be kindly very brief. And if you have a particular speaker to whom you want to address it, please name. So I think we will start with this gentleman, and we'll try to go around. Brief questions, please.
So, ma'am and sirs, what is the current status of the education system of India? Have the right-wing people come in, or it's still tightly controlled by the left?
To whom is your question addressed?
Well, I'll just answer about the school textbooks. The current books, they have been there for the 2 terms of UPA government, that is 10 years, and 4 years of the present regime, that is 14 years. And I just want to say 1 or 2 things about these textbooks, if I may. This is the second set of textbooks written by left historians. The first set was written by Romila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, and Satish Chandra. Now, the problem with those textbooks that they were overtly anti-Hindu and anti-Indic civilization. And as communities became more and more enlightened, they started protesting against those narratives. So, when UPA 1 came into power, they commissioned a new set of textbooks. These textbooks are not written by one historian, but they are written by the entire faculty of JNU. So each book is the handiwork of the entire history department of JNU. What they have done this time is that they have been quite clever, and they have not shown an open animosity to Indian culture and Indian civilization. But the agenda remains the same. So one thing that they have done is that there is no chronology. They have abolished all dates. So if there are no dates, the student doesn't have any idea of history. And to give you an example, Mahmud Ghaznavi is mentioned in the same sentence as Raja Chola. This is not an exaggeration, you can go and check it up. So if there is no mention of Arab invasions, Turkish invasions. So if Mahmud Ghaznavi is mentioned in the same para as Raja Chola, then a student will think that they were both rulers of India and there was nothing to differentiate between them. So this lack of chronology is one very clever device that has been adopted by the new left scholars as far as Indian history is concerned.
Let us continue this in this direction. There are lots of hands. We'll go round.
Sure. We talk about facts, opinions, and textbooks. What would it take to force our textbook authors to add references? Because, for example, if we take something like Aryan invasion theory, these references cannot go back before 18th century. An enlightened student can make a differentiation that these are concocted tales that came after the 18th century. I'm presuming this would be not a very difficult war to wage. Can we do something about it?
A very brief answer. First of all, the class 6 NCERT textbook has somehow avoided, that was at least one step forward, avoided the entire Aryan invasion theory. It does speak of the Harappans and later on the Vedic people, but there is no mention of an invasion or migration. However, it comes in later textbooks, I think class 11 or something, 12 is it? And the solution, of course, is that this government should have, as soon as possible, but it's too late now, should have commissioned a large based committee of neutral historians. I say neutral because there are actually a lot of neutral historians in India. They're never highlighted in the press. People who simply do their job honestly and who are meticulous about gathering material. We know lots of them. So there should have been such a broad-based group of people to, because there is one thing which needs to be well understood. All textbooks need to be revised constantly. Even textbooks of physics or mathematics need to be revised from time to time. So therefore, it should be accepted that this is simply a regular, ongoing process. It's not simply to... So therefore, there is here a failure so far, and let us keep hoping. No, wait. I think this takes us into a whole debate about the nature of history, and we'll continue with other questions for the moment.
Thank you for the panel. A bit of a background, I'm an economics student in the Netherlands. So 2 reactions I had. So to Mr. Sethi. So you spoke about the relationship that, the research scholars have with professors at JNU, for example. Even though that the outcome may be bad from what we can see, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Because, in economics, in our classes, we study about, for example, there's the Chicago School of Thought. There's the Stockholm School of Thought. There's the Lausanne School of Thought. So, like from all the economists coming out of the University of Chicago, for example, Friedman, Becker, Stigler, they have certain characteristic to that specific department at Chicago. So, I don't think there's something wrong with a characteristic to JNU, for example, or DU, for example, as a whole. So, what do you think?
I have been taught by both. This is the beauty of American education so far. I've been taught by both the saltwater and I have been taught by both the saltwater and the freshwater economists, so to say. And I can tell you that the disruptions in these school of thoughts have come in from the very same universities. It was the saltwater economists which were in Boston, in Harvard and MIT, who challenged the fundamentals through behavioral economics, etc. Can you dare say this thing is going to happen in the Indian education system, which is completely, choked of any fresh thought process coming in? My problem with this cabal is that it is very carefully cultivated, nurtured. They are taught into the methods of preservation of their form of truth. For them, history can never be a myth. History is always scientific, and all the scientific inventions they have already done. There is no other invention left in history now. That is their basis. And this is why they keep telling that you have to ensure that there is no contamination to these scientific inventions. So there are severe problems because you come out indoctrinated as if it's a religion. Once you are indoctrinated into something, you stop questioning that. And that's where everything starts taking a tailspin.
Thank you. Just one more.
I think we have to move on because there are lots of hands. We'll go round.
Yeah, 2 quick questions. One, as a layman, taking a little more than enthusiastic interest in history, I always wondered if we could have history books which would very clearly lay out the facts or archaeological evidence, whatever kind of evidence separately, and then the interpretation of the value judgments, as they're called, in a separate section, so that then each one of us could wear the hat of layman's historian and see how we fit in. That was one part. Second part, I come from Hyderabad, and there was a small research group which was formed there, which was trying to investigate the history of education in India, taking the current syllabus of NCERT, CBSE books, and how far back in history can we go to, maybe till the British era at least, to see the changes in the content and the overall syllabus. So if anybody can help on that from the group, I would like to connect with you offline and take some help and guidance on that. Thank you.
See, first, a very quick answer to your first question on separating facts from interpretation. It is not realistic. It cannot be done. The problem is, what is a fact? If you say, for example, in Mohenjo-daro, there is a great bath of this dimension, and so on. You cannot stop there. You have to explain what could have been this great bath, and immediately you are interpreting. And there are 2, 3 possible interpretations of what this great bath was and who was using it and for what purpose. So therefore, it would be totally artificial and dry to simply come up with, well, there's this monument, full stop, and we stop there. It will not work. People want to know why. Immediately they would ask why, who, how, and so on. I don't think, but there is such a thing as being honest about the various interpretations. So if, for example, I mentioned the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, it's a tiny example, I will say these are the 3 interpretations which have been given by archaeologists in the course of time. And then I'll explain the pros and cons of each. And I will leave it at that. I will not even express my opinion. I would leave it to the students, once they are well informed, to form their own judgment. So this is, to me, a more honest way of handling the historical evidence. Unfortunately, not too many people want it that way. Second question, would you like to answer? The second question was about the history of textbook writing and history education in India. There are papers. There have been papers. There's one brilliant paper by an American scholar who did a lot of work on, in fact, the rewriting of history textbooks at the time of the Jagannath Pandith. There's one such at the time of Morarji Desai, because that is when the whole rewriting business started. So there have been some scattered papers and research on that, but it would be interesting to have a detail. Yvette Rosser, American scholar, did quite a bit of work. It was part of her PhD thesis on history textbook writing and rewriting in India.
One of her papers is available on the net.
So that's, well, you can remember her name, Yvette Rosser. That is one would, yeah. Anand is right at the, okay, well, next, you'll be next, Anand, you'll be next. Mike is.
Can I ask?
Next one. You are the next one.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask a question to Meenakshi madam. What steps are being taken now by the current regime on correcting the history interpretation? I know you have said a little bit, but my question is actually twofold. One is that, and
No,
second
what is
is
the first question? What
steps are being taken? What exactly is being done now to correct these history books? Now, you have already said that has not changed till now. It is. I'm expecting. Hopefully, we are all expecting. Maybe it will change. But maybe your point of view, what is being done to change that, or what will be done?
No.
And second, sorry, I have just one more part, which is actually connected to that. How will we ensure that we don't make the same mistakes which has been made by the past disposition for last 70 years on making it overtly biased towards right now? It has to be balanced view, right?
Yes. As far as the history textbooks are concerned, there has been no step taken by the government. So those UPA government textbooks, which were there for 2 terms of UPA and 4 years of this government, they remain in place, and they will remain in place in the near future also, because you cannot write a textbook in a day. So even if they commission somebody, it will take at least a year. So we can expect no development on the textbook front. But what is heartening is that outside NCERT, a group of historians, political scientists have stepped forward and tried to present a view of the past which is non-left and is not bigoted and idiotic right, so-called. So we are pleading for a narrative which is more inclusive, which does not suffer from the same prejudices that the left suffers from, and takes into account a wider array of sources. So Michel Danino, who's sitting here, has done pioneering work on the Aryan invasion. His book has been published by Penguin, and the publisher makes a difference because that's accessible to so many people. And he has not taken any so-called pro line. He has let the facts speak for themselves. And he has quoted German archaeologists, surveyors who came to India in the early 19th century. He's shown maps which authenticate the view of the Hindus that there was a Saraswati river. So he has not, I'm just giving one example, he has not let his thinking dominate the writing of that book. He has reproduced or discovered works that were written in French more than 1.5 centuries ago, maps that were produced in France. And so this is a more objective view than just saying that the Aryans came and showing no proof. When you say that the Aryan invasion took place, then every invasion leaves some traces, isn't it? There have to be traces of that invasion. There have to be remnants of that invasion to back your theory. So in that case, I feel that they have nothing. they have not cited evidence. It is just prejudice. But in the so-called non-left group, we have tried to bring facts and not speak ourselves.
Anand, yes?
Thank you. This is a question for PK Basu. We heard Ms. Jain say that in 1969 the communists picked education portfolio very carefully. And he also mentioned that the challenge to intellectual consensus comes from within the establishment in saltwater and freshwater schools. So in India, why is such a strategic thinking not displayed by the so-called right? And if it is coming back to office in 2019, what would be your advice to the right? Thank you.
Well, I think we don't have to overtly begin a project to rewrite history with an ideological bias. All that needs to be done is to correct the existing biases that are really quite extreme. So, for instance, with the freedom movement, the mythology of the freedom movement that has been perpetuated in India is that ahimsa brought us freedom, that quit India somehow magically led to 1947, and nobody else was involved. So, what needs to be redone to this story is to fill in the details of why, for instance, if you just ask some simple questions. If the Congress was doing so well, how is it that, on the 20th of August 1917, the Secretary of State Montagu basically promised India dominion status almost 101 years ago tomorrow. And yet, instead, we got the Rowlatt Act. Why? The Rowlatt Act was something like the 1975 emergency plus. Now, how is it that the Rowlatt Act came in March 1919 instead of dominion status? Dominion status was promised, instead we got the Rowlatt Act. Similarly, how is it that in May 1945, the British Chiefs of Staff were planning what is required to rule India for the next 15 years, until 1960. There was no question of giving India independence. There was perhaps some constitutional changes along the lines of the 1935 Government of India Act, which all of us should read. Anyway, now, how is it that from there you had, first of all, a Royal Indian Navy mutiny, a Royal Indian Air Force mutiny, and a mutiny in the Jabalpur and Madras regiments, all of which is whitewashed from our understanding of history, but which is actually what brought us independence. In fact, 19th of February 1946, suddenly Attlee announced the cabinet mission to India. Now, the cabinet mission was the first time that the word independence ever came in to a prime ministerial statement on the future of India. And it happened immediately, the day after the Royal Indian Navy mutiny had reached all the ports of India. Now, this is all whitewashed completely. The Ghadar movement is whitewashed. The role, when Madan Lal Dhingra shot Curzon Willie and he gave a statement at the Old Bailey in London, Winston Churchill, who was president of the Board of Trade, said, "This is a statement about patriotism that will be remembered 2,000 years from now, when all of us are forgotten. Like we remember Plutarch's heroes, they will remember Madan Lal Dhingra's words." How many of us, I didn't even quite know what Madan Lal Dhingra had done until I started reading up all this. So, Churchill was lousy on most things. This prediction may or may not come true. We still have a few 1900 years or so to figure that one out. But the point is that, again, the Marathas, we don't know that between 1715, in our textbooks, they're completely ignored. From 1715 to 1805 and perhaps 1818, the Marathas were the most prominent power in India. Whether you think about the west coast of India, where you had Kanhoji Angre, or you have Bajirao, who Bernie Montgomery considered to be the greatest cavalry general in history until that point. There is a Sherman tank in the US that is named after William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman based his tactics in the American Civil War on Bajirao's cavalry tactics. Where's the Bajirao tank in the Indian Army? So these are stories. I mean, the whole period of the Maratha. Now, in Delhi, half of Delhi is called Safdarjung. Who was Safdarjung? Safdarjung was a minor ruler in the later Timurid period, in the later Mughal period. He was of no consequence. At that time, the Mughal emperor was a vassal of the Scindias. Where is the Mahadaji Scindia road? The third battle of Panipat was fought between Mahadaji Scindia and the ancestor of the Durrani kings of Afghanistan. But so these are the small corrections. And then, of course, the additional correction is the lack of understanding of the importance of the revolutionary movement, starting with Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo started the revolutionary movement in 1906, and Lokmanya Tilak.
The precise.
So if we miss the revolutionary aspect and the importance of the British Indian Army to holding the whole edifice of European empires in India together, the fact that that is neglected means that we as a nation lose the ability to think strategically. And that is why we had the disaster of the Chinese invasion of Tibet in October 1950. We let that happen. At least Jawaharlal Nehru let it happen. If Patel knew about it, he wouldn't have let it happen. He only heard about it 3 or 4 weeks after it had begun. And it was kept so secret. And then, of course, we had Krishna Menon. We have a Krishna Menon marg every day. When Atal Bihari Vajpayee's body was being taken, I was lamenting the fact that he lived on 6B Krishna Menon marg. It's like having a Benedict Arnold Road in Washington, D.C. I mean, the ultimate failure, the worst defense minister, even Maulana Azad wrote about him 4 years before Maulana Azad died. He said, we all could see, Gandhiji, Patel and I could see that this man was a communist fellow traveler, not to be trusted. He wrote this 4 years before the 1962 war. He says in his book, we all like our admirers, but Jawaharlal likes his admirers a bit more than others. And this fellow, so all these aspects, if we fail to look at the strategic logic of why 1962 happened, and why October 1950 happened, and how the British Indian Empire, not just the British Indian, entire edifice of European empires was held together by the British Indian Army, whether it was the Opium Wars of the 1840s, the Taiping Rebellion in China in the 1860s, the Boxer Rebellion in the 1900s, the First World War, the Second World War. It was the British Indian Army fighting everywhere across Asia. So it was a tremendously powerful army. We let that be completely dissipated, and as a result, we had the disaster of 62. We almost had a disaster in 65. Luckily, we had a non-Nehru leading us then, and we at least had a draw or a slight, maybe marginal victory in the 65 war. So now the point is, the strategic logic of our thinking has never become part of the way we think. So I don't know if that was what you were trying to ask, Anand. Strategic logic.
There are still 2-3 questions. This gentleman there has been, and we'll come to you, Tapas.
He has been in the
I know.
Nice,
So
very
one, two,
enlightening presentations, all of you. I'm very happy to be here to listen to all of you. My question is that, we have alternative literature for Indian history from ancient to now. Will you prescribe 5-6 books for not a right winger, rooted in Indian tradition, firmly not accepting right-left classification?
There may be scattered books, yes, on certain specific issues and periods, and you have to find them out. So I think some of our friends in the Indic Academy have been trying to do that, to list books which do provide an alternative. But we don't have a comprehensive history of India, except the old one, which was edited by R.C. Majumdar, History and Culture of the Indian People, 11 volumes, still a major source of history and nationalistic approach, you might say. However, it's a bit outdated in many respects, so therefore something has to be reattempted. I would like to move on to, yes, you.
And Jagannath Sarkar, I mean, you know,
Yes, but
there's a long tradition of historical writing by great Indic historians. Jagannath Sarkar not only wrote about the late Mughals, he wrote about the Shivaji,
yes.
you know, and
Altekar also. These were the stalwarts of the nationalist school. However, in all these domains, a lot of fresh evidence needs to be integrated, and therefore they have to be read, but they cannot be taken as the last word either.
So yeah, 85 minutes we have discussed what the narrative has, what they have been setting, and there has been an alternative narrative as well. And some of the work is done by you, both of you, and you also, and by you also. So my question is regarding what role the state can play, and where BJP has either failed or has it helped, or maybe a better role it could have played. Can you just enlighten us on that?
Since I represent one of these states, states can have, I mean, state can never have any role directly or indirectly. The BJP, when it came in power in 2014, one of the prime agendas was to look into the education policy. You know, a small attempt in that direction was made, that we are going to look at the national education policy. A draft was prepared and put into the public domain for a very long period of time, just to gather comments from public at large. But you know, whenever any state takes this attempt forward, it is always looked from an ideological lenses. There was an enormous public outcry that there is this exercise of saffronization of education happening. And the narrative was beyond control. Nobody, as powerful as Modi ji might believe that he is, he could not control the aggressive opposition that came to a very small, very logical step. Because whenever state comes in and tries to do this thing, it often falls into the trap that they are trying to change the education suiting their own ideological needs. So that is why I think history has to be delineated from state and from politics of the day in order to have longevity behind it. How do you do that? I mean, several of you have asked this question, what do we do? What do we do? At the end of the day, it is all about triangulation. You keep triangulating facts, and more than facts, you triangulate context. If it is, which was the primary reason which we should attribute to India's independence in 47? Then read about Churchill's own biography, own autobiography. What was he thinking during those same set of years? Look at commentators, both Indian, American, and British commentators. What were they saying about India during that time? No, nobody is saying the full picture, but they are giving you vital insights into the context that lies around which some fact has occurred. The fact is there, but the context will add you and will give you such important perspectives, then you will be able to come out and construct a version. That might again not be true. It will be a version of the history which you would want to take and be the principal, I would say, protagonist for that version of history. That's all we can do. We can all work on our own versions, try to improve by triangulating it.
Can I just recommend something on the freedom movement? It is a very surprising story that the best modern works on the freedom movement have been done by two professors of JNU. And I know both of them. One is no more there, and the second is Professor Bhagwan Josh. Bhagwan Josh was a hardcore leftist, and he wrote the first 2 volumes of a 3-volume study on the freedom movement. Those 2 volumes were reviewed in at least 51 newspapers and journals in India and abroad, because there he took the standard left line. By the time he came to the third volume, there had been a substantial change in his perspective. He remained a leftist, but he realized that what he's writing is not correct. So the third volume of the history of the freedom movement is written the way Michel would write it or I would write it. And he was telling me that not one newspaper or magazine or journal reviewed the third volume. There were 51 reviews for the first 2 volumes, and the third volume does not have a single review. And the second work is by Bimal Prasad. He has passed away. He has written the most balanced, the most authentic study of the freedom movement. He was a congressman. He was appointed as ambassador to Pakistan also. Very eminent scholar and totally non-ideological.
I think we have time. I'm so sorry. It's 3:30. We have time only for one question. Tapas has been raising a hand for a long, long time. We can try 2 if both of you are very brief. And if the answers are equally brief, we can try. And then we'll have to close.
In the before independence of India and after, in the creation and formation of a national identity as an Indian. Yesterday somebody was claiming that it goes beyond the borders of just the geographical India. At the same time, what would be the, while the identity is in its becoming and still discovering, what would be the role of history in that? To what extent would that help an Indian grow? Secondly, how can we de-link, whether it's the left or the right wing of any government? Can't history have its own independent research center?
Can I try 2 very brief answers? The first is very well known. History is central to the formation of identity, and that is why all cultures have found ways to preserve their own history. Even in India, we don't give much attention to oral history. Go to Rajasthan or Gujarat, it's full of ballads, it's full of legends. It's also a way of conveying a certain history. So history is certainly central. Without history, you cannot build a national identity. No country ever in the world tried. Even the Soviet Union depended on the history of the revolution, after all. So I think the answer is quite clear. As to whether it's possible to have a more objective, factual history, the answer is no. There is no objective history. It does not exist. However, as I said, there can be a more honest. If you take, for example, ancient India, there used to be always Romila Thapar and R.S. Sharma and D.N. Jha and all this clique. Then we had a far more honest work about 10 years ago by Upinder Singh. She happens to be the daughter of Manmohan Singh, but never mind. She's a very scrupulous, honest historian. She may have her own choices, her own biases. However, it's a vast improvement, a major step forward. So we have to keep, these steps forward. And the question is whether the author has a predetermined ideology, or is it genuinely trying to understand and grasp what was there, what happened, what were all the factors? That is actually the central question. So last question, please, madam.
Use this.
So my question is really more as a concerned mother. I would like to have my daughter, it feels like it's going to be a long wait to have the textbooks change. So I would like to present a book to my daughter which says, the lies my NCRT books tell me. So I don't know whether such a book is coming in the future. And
It has already come.
Okay.
The title of that book is Fallacies in the ICHR report. So that is, 1 minute. when we wrote, when last time the government, BJP government was there and Murli Manohar Joshi was the education minister, so he asked us to write a new set of textbooks. I was the author of one of them. So there were problems with these textbooks, I won't deny it. But the left historians brought out a book which chronicled all the wrongs in our books, to which we replied. So that our reply is something that will help you. It's there on the net.
But that is for her, not for her children.
for the
she
children,
wanted to.
yeah.
She wanted to know whether she can.
She has to read that and educate herself.
As of now, unfortunately, that is the answer, and I was going to give the same. The parents have to first educate themselves.
Can you please repeat the name of
Fallacies in the
IHC report.
IHC.
The IHC report.
You can try a popular history by Sanjeev Sanyal also.
Yes.
Land of the Seven Rivers.
So there are, in that way, there are a number of, for different periods, there are a number of
But wait, give
people
us
who
5
have.
years, we will have, outside the NCRT, we will produce.
There will be more things, I'm sure. So I think there is no need of a conclusion. You have understood that this is an open-ended and less debate. There would be so much more to say, and there's so much more work to do. I just want to say that in the end, I agree with Rajat Sethi's point that let us not be over-obsessed by textbooks and curricula. There is a lot of work on history through now videos. There are some good documentaries once in a while, but we have to kind of look for them. And there are alternative ways. It's not as if our knowledge of history must be absolutely confined to NCRT textbooks or to the school classroom. We can also learn history. It's up to the parents to take their children to museums, to inform themselves, to make their view films, etc. There are alternatives. So anyway, there's a long way to go, and let us keep working. And thank you all very much, and thanks especially to our 3 speakers.